يا أبا عبد الله يا حسين بن علي أيها الشهيد يا ابن رسول الله.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا نبينا محمد وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. It is narrated that Imam Hussain alayhi salam once said to Allah, "O Allah, you know all that took place at our hand." Meaning that Allah knows about all the struggles that the Ahlul Bayt faced against evil. The Imam then says, "It was not for the love of kingship, nor was it to gain wealth, but it was for manifesting the signs and symbols of your religion and to bring about reform in your cities." And this in itself is often one of the reasons why people label this tragedy that befell the Imam as the greatest sacrifice known to man. And if we look at what the Imam specifically mentions that he didn't fight for, that's the love of wealth and the love of kingship or power. So how can we as the followers of Ahlul Bayt recognize if we have fallen into the trap of loving power or loving wealth or loving the dunya, and how are all these three things interlinked? So let's look at some of the advice from our Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. We will start with a reminder from Imam Ali, who tells us, "Whoever wishes to spend the rest of his days as a free man must not allow greed to abide in his heart." You'll often find that this is a running theme from the Ahlul Bayt in many ahadith, that greed makes one a slave of his own desires. Why? Because in another hadith, Imam Ali tells us that the love of this world engenders greed, and that piety and greed can never come together. And the impact or the adverse effect that greed has on piety is captured brilliantly by the Prophet Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, when he says, "The love of this world is the origin of every act of disobedience and the beginning of every sin." The love of the world is the beginning or the origin of every act of disobedience and the beginning of every sin. Now this is clearly relevant on the day of Ashura, and it's a character trait that's found in the enemies of Allah, which we will look at in a second. But it's also a warning for us, the followers of the Ahlul Bayt. Because even possessing or having wealth in the slightest, it's a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not necessarily a bad thing by any means, but it is a test. For Shaitan himself says that the rich man is not safe from him. Why? The Shaitan explains, he says, there are three situations in which he tricks the rich man. The first situation, the Shaitan says, "I embellish his riches in his eyes so that he deprives it to whoever has a right to it." What does that actually mean? That he doesn't give some of his wealth to charity, to the hungry, to the orphan, because the Shaitan has made it seem that his wealth is less. So he loses out on giving to those who actually have a right over his wealth. The second way that the Shaitan mentions, "I facilitate its way so that he squanders it in the wrong place." Meaning what? Meaning he wastes it or spends it in a foolish manner on places that he shouldn't be spending his money on, wasting money. And thirdly, and personally I feel is the most important point for me myself to take away, is that I make it so beloved to him that he earns it in a wrong way. بِغَيْرِ حَقِّ, the hadith says, unlawfully. And so I remind myself first that if we are to find ourselves in any of these three situations, then know that we have fallen into the trap of the Shaitan. And we see this on the day of Ashura in the classic example of Umar ibn Sa'd, a man in power. And it's an example which is often narrated to us from the Minbar. He didn't fight Imam Hussain due to his hate or animosity for the Imam, but he wanted to be the ruler of the land of Ray more than anything. And so he had that love of kingship, and that took over him. And Imam Hussain uses that exact term in his dua. We did not face these troubles for kingship. But if you look at the quality that Ibn Sa'd possesses, it is that same love of kingship that lands him in a situation where he is fighting the holy grandson of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And this in itself is a reminder of Imam Ali's hadith that I mentioned at the beginning, when Imam Ali says, piety and greed can never come together. For Ibn Sa'd had greed for kingship, greed for power. And so just to finish, Allah mentions in the Qur'an, chapter 64, verse 15, إِنَّمَا أَمْوَالُكُمْ وَأَوْلَادُكُمْ فِتْنَةٌ وَاللَّهُ عِنْدَهُ أَجْرٌ عَظِيمٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, chapter 64, verse 15, that your wealth and your children are but a trial. They are a trial for us. And with Allah is a great reward. وَاللَّهُ عِنْدَهُ أَجْرٌ عَظِيمٌ. So with that being said, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we are able to stay away from the love of dunya, from the love of wealth, from the love of power, and that in the words of Imam Baqir alayhi salam, we do not become a slave to our greed, and that we can follow the Ahlul Bayt's footsteps in not succumbing to the love of dunya. And lastly, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the hasty reappearance of our 12th holy Imam, Imam Sahib al-Asli wa Zaman, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi.
Ya Mawlana, Ya Aba Abdillah, Ya Hussain ibn Ali, أيها الشهيد يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يدي حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله.